Welcome everyone to our Smart Policing Initiative webinar on less lethal technologies and law enforcement. This is one of a series of webinars sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and coordinated by CNA, the training and technical assistance provider for the Smart Policing Initiative. To date, we've conducted over 30 webinars, which are available on our SPI website, and we have 2 more planned for this fall on collaborating with communities of color and misdebugs in criminology. Today's webinar, though, on less lethal technologies in law enforcement, we feel is very timely due to the recent and ongoing challenges police across the nation are experiencing with use of force and brutality and efforts to enhance community trust and police legitimacy. In the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, they have highlighted the important role of technology in policing and the need to develop national standards for research and development in new technologies, including less than lethal technologies, and the importance to adopt appropriate model policies and best practices for technology-based community engagement that increase trust and access. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide you with an introduction to less lethal technologies, specifically as it relates to issues of training, policy, and what is considered legal use of force, as well as an overview of various technologies, including prior, existing, and newly developed and future devices. Today, we're very fortunate to have Charles Stephenson as our presenter and facilitator for this webinar. He is our go-to subject matter expert with the Smart Policing Initiative when it comes to technology. Charles has worked with a number of our SPI sites over the past few years and previously developed a webinar for us on technology in policing in 2011. Charles is a public safety technologist who for the past decade has assisted a wide range of police and public safety agencies in addressing their technology needs and challenges while supporting the Department of Justice, including the Office of Justice Programs, the National Institute of Justice, and the National Law Enforcement and Technology Centers. He has experience in technology and system operation, development, and new equipment fielding, and has supported everything from tactical operations up through strategic communications throughout the U.S., Europe, Africa, Russia, Korea, and the Middle East. So we are very proud to have Charles working on our Smart Policing Initiative team. We want to thank the Bureau of Justice Assistance for its long-standing support. They don't just support smart policing, they really champion it. And we also want to thank Charles and the staff at CNA for their effort in putting this webinar together. We're confident that you're going to learn something new and interesting today about less lethal technologies. Before I hand this webinar off to Charles, I just want to go over a few other administrative and logistical comments. The first is that this webinar is being recorded for the benefit of others who may view it at a later time on our website. We will have this webinar recording posted online with the presentation and recommended resources within the coming weeks. In addition, throughout the presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions and comments. We call these our stop and talk, and we really encourage you to speak up when the opportunity presents itself. Others on the webinar will certainly be interested in hearing what you have to say. You will also see that there is a chat capability in the WebEx software here. This should be on the right-hand side of your computer screen. There you can share your comments and questions with the presenter and others throughout the webinar. We will monitor and facilitate responses to your questions throughout the presentation. Finally, immediately following the webinar, you'll receive a request to evaluate it. We ask that you complete this evaluation and give us your honest and thoughts and recommendations. It's very useful information for us as we continue to develop additional webinars in the future. So let me hand this over to Charles to begin our presentation and thank everyone else for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Vivian. And again, welcome everyone to Smart Policing's webinar on less lethal technologies. For the benefit of everyone viewing today's webinar that is either new or unfamiliar with the Smart Policing Initiative, I'd like to take a few moments and talk a little about SPI. SPI is a Bureau of Justice Assistance sponsored initiative that supports law enforcement agencies in building evidence-based, data-driven law enforcement. tactics, and strategies that are effective, efficient, and hopefully economical. This is accomplished by using a strategic approach that brings more science into daily police operations. SPI leverages innovative applications of analysis, evidence-based practices, and technologies. Of course, today's webinar is going to focus on technology, specifically technologies classified as less lethal. Additionally, before I get started, I'd like to point out a few things. The first is, even though you may see a term on a slide such as non-lethal or non-deadly, or hear me refer to such, that does not necessarily mean that the technology being presented could not result in the death of someone. The possibility does still exist and should not be overlooked or taken lightly by users of technologies that are classified as less than lethal. Also, I'd like to note that we're only referencing less lethal technologies. There are other types of force that may also be considered and included as less lethal or non-deadly, such as defensive tactics. I would like to begin by talking a little bit about the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. The final report recommends that the federal government should support the development of new, less than lethal technologies to help control combative suspects. However, these technologies must be used within a defined policy framework that balances community trust and legitimacy with the purposes and goals. The report further goes on to point out that federal agencies, including the Department of Defense and Justice, should expand their efforts to study the development and use of new less than lethal technologies and evaluate their impact on public safety, reducing less lethal violence against citizens, constitutionality, and officer safety. However, departments must recognize that technology is only a tool, and just because you have access to the tool does not necessarily mean that you should always use it. Over the course of the next hour, I will start first with an introduction providing some common definitions pertaining to the subject of less lethal, to include how the Fourth Amendment comes into play when an officer makes a choice and uses a less than lethal method, or method, as frequently more than one method is used to bring someone into compliance. Also, I will touch on the use and give a brief history on less lethal, as it is recorded use can be dated back thousands of years. However, please keep in mind some of the examples presented, even though thought to be the best solution at the time, may in fact have been a poor choice in retrospect. We will then get into an oversight of technologies, specifically mechanical and kinetic technologies, such as rubber bullets and beanbags, conducted energy technologies, such as tasers, directed energy technologies, such as flashbangs, throw lasers, dazzlers, and the use of acoustics. We will then move on to chemical agents, and these are pepper sprays, tear gas, and then the last technology we'll talk about briefly will be barrier and entanglement devices, stanchions, spike strips, what have you. After the overview, we will then move on to risk and safety to both user and suspect, followed by a discussion on the importance of training, and then after training I will discuss departmental policies and the use of the force continuum. I will get into new technologies briefly that are being used today, followed by possible future technologies that are currently being developed or considered, and then wrap things up with a conclusion. After that, we will open things up for discussion and any questions. I'd like to begin on what is deadly force. Well, deadly force is defined as the amount of force that is likely to cause either serious bodily injury or death to another person. What is less than lethal force? Less than lethal force is defined as any use of force less than deadly force. What is a less lethal weapon? Less lethal weapons are any devices that are intended to be less likely to kill a living target than traditional weapons. Many common less lethal weapons are designed to expel or propel less lethal ammunition by an action, a mechanism, or process for the purpose of incapacitating, immobilizing, or stunning a human being through the infliction of physical pain or discomfort. It should be noted that it's not necessary that the weapon leave any lasting or permanent mark, incapacitation, or discomfort, pain, or other injury or disability in order to qualify as a less lethal weapon. Such weapons can be termed, of course, as non-lethal weapons, less than lethal weapons, non-deadly weapons, compliance weapons, or pain-inducing weapons. How much and when may a law enforcement officer use force? Well, the U.S. Supreme Court view is a law enforcement officer may use as much force as is reasonably required to overcome an offender that is resisting arrest. What is reasonable? Again, the Supreme Court has defined the objective standard of reasonableness as a balance between the rights of the person being arrested and the government interest. When is deadly force considered meeting constitutional intention? Well, for deadly force to be considered legal when an arrest is taking place, it must be the reasonable choice under all circumstances at the time. Therefore, deadly force should be looked at as an option that is used when it is believed that there no other action will succeed. Force defined internationally is close to what we define. From a global standpoint, the United Nations basic principles on the use of force and firearms is if the law enforcement officials shall not use firearms against persons except in self-defense or the defense of others unless the imminent threat of death or serious injury, and that in any event intentional lethal use of firearms may only be made when strictly unavoidable in order to protect life. International law further goes on to say only allows police officers to use lethal force as a last resort in order to protect themselves or others from death or serious injury. As far as the use of non-lethal force, it may be used in circumstances where lethal force is prohibited or undesirable. And of course, this varies from country to country. Before we discuss the use of less lethal methods by law enforcement, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes examining the Fourth Amendment. I'd like to look at what is the Fourth Amendment, the leading case on use of force, and of course that is the 1989 Supreme Court decision in Graham versus Connor. And then what does it all mean? What is excessive force, and what is really considered reasonable force? Beginning with the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, it provides the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. It shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. The ultimate goal of this provision is to protect people's right to privacy and freedom from arbitrary governmental intrusions. Private intrusions not acting in the color of governmental authority are exempted from the Fourth Amendment. The leading case on use of force is a 1989 Supreme Court decision in Graham versus Connor. The court held that all claims that law enforcement officers have used excessive force, deadly or not, in the course of an arrest, investigatory stop, or other seizure of a free citizen should be analyzed under the Fourth Amendment and its objective reasonableness standard. Furthermore, the Supreme Court stated that the test for reasonableness under the Fourth Amendment is not capable of precise definition or mechanical application. Allowance must be made for the fact that police officers are often forced to make split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving about the amount of force that is necessary in a particular situation. The conclusion from all this is going to remain a difficult decision on just how much force to use, whether less lethal or deadly. The courts will continue to look at, did the force fall within the range of reasonableness, or was it excessive and therefore unconstitutional? Getting back to our subject for today, less lethal technologies, why or when do we use less lethal weapons? In law enforcement, the primary use in law enforcement is in confrontations like resisting arrest, suicide interventions, during riots, and quite often when prisoners get out of hand or during large-scale prison disturbances. Plus, less lethal force may also be used during hostage rescues. The technologies that we use are designed to temporarily incapacitate, confuse, delay, or restrain an adversary. In fact, we may use several technologies in combination to bring a suspect into compliance or get control of a situation. When is less lethal force used? Probably the most common is when individuals resist arrest. However, we also use less lethal when lethal force is not appropriate example, to break up a protest that may be getting out of hand, we may choose to use CS tear gas or maybe OC pepper spray. In fact, it was used to break up crowds in Ferguson, Missouri. Less than lethal force is also used frequently when lethal force is justified, but lesser force may subdue the aggressor. And an example of this may be the use of CS to end a hostage situation. Also, another instance when an agency may choose less lethal over deadly force is when lethal force is justified, but its use could cause collateral effects, injury to bystanders, damage to property, and or the environment. An example of this would be when it's difficult to determine suspect from victim or bystander. And then one last comment before we move on is that a majority of agencies do limit certain types of less lethal weapons, such as sponge rounds, impact munitions, tear gas, to special operation units. The next slide, and I mentioned them a little bit earlier in the presentation, provides some common terms that you may see manufacturers or vendors, the media, or those that write about less than lethal discuss or refer to the use of less lethal weapons. You may see or hear individuals refer to less lethal as non-lethal weapons, less than lethal weapons, non-deadly weapons, compliance weapons, and pain-inducing weapons. Again, as a note, even though you may see the term non-lethal or non-deadly, the potential to cause death due to using such a weapon in a situation that is outside a controlled environment that the weapon was originally designed in can result in the death or deaths of those that are on the receiving end. The next several slides are going to be briefly cover the history up to the modern day use of less lethal methods. As you can see, the use of less lethal methods can be traced back thousands of years. However, as noted earlier, the methods chosen may have been a poor choice, and when balanced against constitutionality and the overall well-being of the community, may have not been the right choice. One early example of less lethal was the use of the water chestnuts. Water chestnuts were collected and then dispersed on paths in front of an advancing army to slow the advance of mounted soldiers. Really not much has changed over time, as we do have a modern-day version of the same technology. The only difference is ours is no longer dependent on something that is grown, but on something that is easily manufactured in large quantities and made out of hardened steel to stop vehicles. The next example more recently illustrates the use of horses and water cannons. Water cannons have been and are still in use in many nations to disperse large crowds. As far as the use of horse, a mounted officer can be a very persuasive method of controlling large gatherings of people, whether are used to keep individuals from entering a specific area or dispersing a crowd that has gotten out of hand. Plus, another advantage of a mounted officer, it does have an added benefit of creating a positive public image of law enforcement. A couple more examples of early methods are the use of dogs and tear gas. I think everyone will agree an officer with a trained canine can strike fear in the biggest individual, and in most circumstances get the person to do what is asked. For large crowds, similar to the application of a water cannon, tear gas has been and will be continued to be used to disperse crowds in or to get someone to leave confined areas, such as a building or specific room. Now I'd like to move into the overview of the technologies, and I'd like to start out with the mechanical and kinetic devices. Kinetic less lethal weapons are intended not to kill, but to influence the behavior of a subject by introducing physical discomfort or pain through blunt impact of device. The level of trauma pain caused by the device should be relatively short and reversible. Use of the device should not require the target subject to need medical attention. Kinetic devices are most commonly used due to the simplicity and low cost. Examples of mechanical and kinetic devices are the baton, the water cannon, and impact munitions that cause pain, such as the beanbag round, rubber bullet, and grenades containing rubber balls. Some pros and cons, they are low cost, as I mentioned. They're easy to use. However, use can result in serious injury, and in some cases even death has resulted from the use. Also, some communities feel that the use of blunt force trauma devices are an excessive use of force. Conducted energy devices are actually a family of devices that relies on radiated energy to achieve control of a subject in compliance, either by inducing pain or causing involuntary muscle convulsion. This allows officers to use hand control techniques on the subject. Conducted energy devices may be less effective undisturbed of those under influence of drugs or alcohol. Currently, there are three major categories of the device offered. It's a drive stun, a tethered probes, and a launched. Some devices can operate more than one mode and have been adapted for use in riot shields, transport belts, and restraints. Some examples of conducted energy devices are, of course, the stun guns, electrical shock projectiles, and the shock shield and batons. A few pros and cons for these devices are they're still relatively inexpensive and will require minimal training. However, depending on a subject's physical condition, such as someone in poor health, and their mental state that may have been caused by drugs or alcohol, may force the officer to use another method to subdue the individual, and in the case of poor health, the use of a CED could result in the death of the individual that it is used upon. The next category would be the directed energy devices. These are devices that deposit energy on a subject to achieve some type of desired effect, such as to distract, disorient, and incapacitate. Direct energy devices emit energy in an aimed direction, typically without the means of wires or a projectile. Direct energy devices are differentiated by the type of energy created, the method of energy generated, and the power of the energy. Emerging directed energy devices can engage almost instantaneously and have the potential to engage targets at great distance. Some examples of directed energy devices are flashbangs, throw lights, the laser dazzlers. You can even include today's high-powered flashlights. And then there's the LRADs, which are extremely powerful directional long-range acoustic devices that can be used to hail or turned up loud enough to cause pain. Some pros and cons with the use of this class of devices. With the exception of the LRAD, they're fairly inexpensive devices and do not require extensive training. However, keep in mind that the use of lasers and acoustic technologies, which were originally developed by the military, can cause permanent hearing or eye damage to the targeted individuals or individuals. The next category are the chemical agents. Chemical agents are designed to deliver pain and or discomfort to individuals to gain compliance. Common use of chemical agents include distraction, deception, barriers, disruption, dispersal, disorientation, disablement, and denial. Examples of chemical agents that incapacitate and or control are malodorant agents that produce a persistent and obnoxious odor, irritant agents that cause temporary pain to the skin and or mucous membranes, smoke agents that allow concealment of activities, calmative agents that produce a euphoric state of calm, and marking agents such as would be the case in paints, dyes, and pigments. Some pros and cons for this type of class of agents would be the use of chemical agents do achieve the desired outcome, such as crowd dispersal. However, in recent years, communities have criticized departments for using chemicals such as CS on their citizens. Then the last category that I'm going to talk about is the barrier entanglement devices. These are passive devices in most cases that are triggered by the actions of the suspect or vehicle. The difference between the two methods are barrier devices are used to control and manage the movement of people and or vehicles, and entanglement devices are used to restrict or inhibit movement. Some examples of barrier devices are, of course, barricades, stanchions, alerts, and these can be either fixed or portable. Examples of entanglement devices are nets, which have a maritime application, and then we have the road spike strips, stop sticks. Pros in the case of the spike strips or stop sticks, they're real easy to use. However, success is dependent on a vehicle running over the device. So they do have to be fairly strategically placed with no avenues of escape for a car to veer off and go around them. Plus, as in the case with the maritime net, you do have to get close enough to the fleeing boat to use the net effectively. Our next slide is our first stop and think slide. And we use these to allow a moment or two for our participants today to give some thought to how our discussion so far relates to their departments. The first one is to just get you thinking about less lethal tools in your own department. And I'd like to take just a few minutes to let you think of what devices or categories you use in your department. Next, we'll discuss effectiveness, risk, and safety of less lethal technologies. Advances in less lethal technology offer the promise of more effective control over resistive suspects with fewer serious injuries to the suspect. In fact, studies show the use of physical force, such as the use of hands and fists and feet as in a kick by officers, increases the officer's odds of injury to officer and suspect alike. However, for instance, like the use of OC pepper spray or conducted energy technology, such as a taser, it does decrease the likelihood of suspect injury by 40% and officer injuries by 70%. Similar to the use of CEDs is the use of body-worn cameras, BWCs. A recent 12-month study that was quoted in the President's Task Force on 21st Policing report concluded that the use of BWCs by police can significantly reduce both officer use of force and complaints against officers. The study found that the officers wearing the cameras had 87.5% fewer incidences in the use of force and 59% fewer complaints than officers not wearing cameras. The mere fact that there was a reduction in the use of force may in fact directly correlate to a reduction in officers' injuries for the officers wearing the cameras. Another important fact to take into account is an officer aiming a gun at a suspect reduces his or her chance of injury by more than 80%. I'd like to talk a little bit about new technologies right now, and the first one would be non-lethal munitions. It's made by Smart Rounds technology. There are other manufacturers making similar rounds. They may manufacture a class of bullets called smart bullets. It's a fairly new class of smart non-lethal projectiles. Can be fired from a 12-gauge launcher. These smart bullets use microelectric mechanical technology, MIMS, and a CMOS image sensor to activate the projectile before it reaches a target at a predetermined point. This particular manufacturer manufactures and offers 3 distinct rounds. One of them would be the shock round. This round is designed to produce a powerful high-pressure pulse just before it hits the target, something similar to a flashbang. They also produce a pepper round projectile. The projectile is actuated before it hits the target, and what it does, it incapacitates by spreading an incapacitant over a large area than that of a pepper ball per se, and that break on impact. So it really allows you to target your OC to where you really want to use it. And then the last one would be your Hemi round, and this is a wireless electric shock round designed to deliver a human electromuscular incapacitating pulse similar to like a taser, 50,000 volts to the body at long range. Another non-lethal munitions manufactured by Security Forces International. They manufacture a line of blunt impact projectiles with collapsible nose that mushrooms upon impact. This is done to absorb some of the kinetic energy of the bullet and spread the impact of the nose over a larger area of the target. They make a maldeodorant round which contains a highly noxious payload that delivers an appalling odor. They also manufacture an OC round that allows for surgical application of pepper spray at a safe distance, and it can also be targeted against an individual or a small group within a localized physical area, eliminating the risk of injury and deliberating discomfort to bystanders. And then the final round I'd like to tell you what we make is a CS tear gas powder round. And what it does, it combines a blunt force trauma with the effects of a micropulverized irritant powder to maximize pain compliance. Another fairly new technology, and this was actually looked at by the Ferguson Police Department, it's a non-lethal munitions. It's the alternative ballistics alternative round. This is a blunt impact projectile. Like I said, it's called the alternative. It decreases the velocity of the bullet and allows the projectile to impact the threat, lessening the bullet's penetrating energy. We still don't know a whole lot about this one. There's not a whole lot of data what agencies are using them. We really need to follow up and find out, because it does use the officer's service weapon to fire the projectile. It actually is caught within that stainless steel ball, which propels the stainless steel ball forward into the subject. After the original fire and it leaves the officer's weapon, then the weapon resorts back to a regular firearm. Next, I would like to discuss less lethal training programs. When it comes to training, departments should always use only certified instructors to instruct and certify law enforcement personnel in the use and handling of less lethal devices. Guidelines or policies should prohibit an officer from being allowed to carry a less lethal device until they have successfully completed an approved initial course of instruction for such device and have been certified in its use. Training either for instructor or the end user should consist of both classroom and field deployment drills in the use of each type of device. It is one thing to learn about something in a classroom and a totally different perspective to use a less lethal weapon outside. A perfect example is in the use of tear gas during a riot. Depending on how strong and which way the wind is blowing, it may be the wrong choice due to ineffectiveness caused by uncontrollable environmental forces. In fact, it may blow right back onto the user. Some examples of typical instructor training, and I'm not talking about the end user, I'm talking about getting your instructors up to speed. And this one will be for OC. The instructor should be taught the different OC aerosol formulations, the OC carrier, OC propellants, how the OC is delivered, and the projectors. Training should include the effectiveness, safety, the liability factors, if any, and the department's policies and procedures. It should also include decontamination, first aid, officer survival techniques, if exposed, and finally a discussion on training to assist instructors in the development of in-house and in-service training and documentation of the program. For less lethal impact munitions, and this again I'm talking about an instructor program, you would want to discuss the delivery systems, whether it's a 12 gauge, 37 millimeter, 40 millimeter, or hand delivered. You would want to include tactical considerations in the use of the impact munitions for crowd control, dynamic entry, hostage rescue, along with barricaded subject situations. You'd really want us to discuss the psychologically and physiological effects, along with any liability considerations, and of course, departmental policy and procedures. Additionally, you want to discuss the topic of blunt trauma, ballistics, and energy should be discussed along with the development to establish in-house or in-service training and documentation. For a chemical munitions instructor program, and what we're talking about here is for CSOC, CN, or even smoke, you'd want to gear training around the different chemical munition types and various forms of chemical agents. Give some thought to the tactical consideration in the use of chemical munitions, especially if you're a department that it is around high-rises, residential subdivisions. It's kind of really dependent on where you do your policing. You really want to give it some thought. Use of chemical munitions in crowd control, barricade subject situations. If possible, have a live deployment and exercise in the use of barricade-penetrated grounds. Additionally, you'd want to cover the topics of course, decontamination and first aid, along with the proper use of the protective mask. Similar to impact munitions, you'd want to cover civil liabilities, departmental policy and procedures, and of course, if this is the only course the instructor teaches, the development to establish in-house in-service training and documentation. As far as distraction device munitions instructor program, you'd want to cover the different distraction device types along with their nomenclature. Also, if they are reloadable or non-reloadable devices, a specific topic that you would want to discuss would the amount of decibels, the PSI and overpressure, the safe handling, storage, and rendering safe procedures, tactical deployment safety considerations, and if any, along with the policy and procedure discussion on any civil liabilities. As with the other less lethal, you'd want to use some type of live fire exercises, and it should take place tailored around the actual scenarios. And lastly, set some expectations for the in-house and in-service training and documentation procedures. This is our second stop and think point, and what I would like you to think about is what type of training do officers receive in your department, and do you think it is adequate? If not, why not? And what possibly can you do to improve it? Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about policy and the force continuum. Most, if not all, law enforcement agencies have policies that guide the use of force. These policies describe an escalating series of actions an officer may take to resolve a situation, which is the ultimate goal. Force continuum generally has many levels of force. Officers are instructed to respond with the level of force appropriate to the situation at hand, acknowledging that an officer may move from one part of this continuum to another in a matter of seconds. It can be a very fluid and fast-changing environment. The first one, and this would be an escalating up, just be an officer presence. No force is used. Considered the best way to resolve a situation. The mere presence of a law enforcement officer works to deter crime or defuse a situation. The officer's attitude would be a professional and non-threatening attitude. Escalating or moving up the continuum. The next is verbalization. Force, once again, is non-physical. Officers issue calm, non-threatening commands, such as, let me see your identification or registration. Officers may increase their volume and shorten commands in an attempt to gain compliance. Short commands might include stop or don't move. Next would be the next level would be your empty hand control. Officers use bodily force to gain control of the situation. There's a soft technique where an officer uses grabs, holds, and joint locks to restrain an individual, and then there's a hard technique. This is where an officer would use punches and kicks to gain compliance. If the situation further escalates, moving up the continuum, the officer may consider using less lethal weapons. And the purpose, of course, is the same as the other ones. The officer uses less lethal technologies to gain control of a situation. And of course, you have various less lethal that you may choose. Blunt impact, officers may use a baton or projectile to mobilize a combative person. If you need to use chemicals, officers may use chemical sprays or projectiles, and better with chemicals to gain compliance. What we're talking about here is the use of pepper spray. If your department has conducted energy devices such as tasers, officers may use CEDs to immobilize an individual. CEDs, of course, discharge a high voltage, low amperage jolt of electricity at a distance. And if lethal force is the last result, officers use lethal force to gain control of the situation. It should only be used if a suspect poses a serious threat to the officer or another individual. Of course, what we're talking about here is the officer using his or her firearm to stop an individual action. However, keep in mind, other things can be just as deadly as a weapon, such as being forced to hit someone with a patrol car. The next, I'd like to talk a few minutes about future technologies. And as you will see, we definitely can use an emphasis placed on research and development. Hopefully, the President's report will kickstart this research. And of course, the first one I'd like to talk about is the millimeter wave system. This has been in development for quite a few years. The millimeter wave technology is sometimes commonly referred to as an active denial technology, ADT. It uses a focused energy beam that produces pain on targeted individuals, quickly repelling potential adversaries with minimal risk or energy to user and subject. It works by causing a reflexive response to escape the beam. If the beam is aimed at you, what's going to happen, you're going to feel a heating sensation, and you're going to want to escape that feeling. The next technology is a radio frequency microwave vehicle stopper. This technology has been in development for quite a few years also. It's designed to be a portable vehicle stopper that would disrupt a vehicle's electrical components, causing the engine to stall. One of the main obstacles that has to be overcome yet on this technology is it must be self-contained and portable. And then there's the issue of what happens when you stall the engine of the vehicle. What happens? You lose power, brakes, and steering. That has to be considered. And then the next technology in development is a distributed sound and light array. This technology uses a combined laser, non-coherent light, and acoustics to produce a synergistic engagement system that would cause auditory impairment. One of the advantages of this technology is it has the potential to support multiple users, such as you could hail with it or warn or deter subjects. Another technology that we may see in the future is more smart munitions that uses a chemical combination to either make a subject drowsy, weak, or disoriented, or a combination of those effects. One such round that I have seen in development is the tranquil round projectile. This round contains a tranquilizer in mist form that sprays the combatant and eliminates their will by causing them to be drowsy, weak, and disoriented. Of course, as in the case with the other future technologies, there are obstacles that must be overcome. First, before we see this type of technology in the field, the proper dosage has to be figured out. Everyone has a different body characteristic, and we need something that will take into account such things as age and weight, whether it's an older individual or whether it's a young child. Also, plus we need to make sure that it reacts quick. Should react in less than 2 seconds to be of use for law enforcement. This is our last and final stop and think. The issue of non-lethal technology is ever-changing and a perceived view by the public, and with new technology being made available. We can see this in the public reaction to what happened in Ferguson. Also, there's yet to be one technology available that fits every situation that may be encountered in the field. And then lastly, when was your department's policy and procedures last reviewed? I would recommend that departments review their policies and procedures for the use of less lethal technologies at least annually to adjust for both changes in public perception and advancements in technology. Our next one is actually our conclusion. I'd like to wrap things up a little bit on our discussion today. And this for agency success or failure of a particular less than lethal technology is not only predicated on the selection of the appropriate device by those officers applying the technology, but is dependent on the proper use, which only can be achieved through knowledge. When used responsibly by well-trained and fully accountable law enforcement officers, less lethal weapons can prevent and minimize deaths and injuries to assailants, suspects, and detainees, as well as protect the officers that use them. I do thank you for participating in today's webinar, and we will put up a slide with some references for you to check more on policies if you want to do a little bit more research. There is a link to the President's report if you'd like to read that, and I do recommend that everyone read that. And what I'd like to do now is open it up to any questions or discussion that anyone would have.
Mm-hmm. We have, at this point, it's still too fluid to give any direct, like federal enforcement or anything of that nature.
I mean, they're all going to be closed. The whole downtown area is really closed. It's just restricted.
Okay, Charles, this is Vivian. So I think we unmuted the lines, hoping that we could allow people to speak if they have questions, but also ask you if you have other conversations going on in the background to remute your line. We'll start off, though, with one question that we did receive in the chat box from Michael White. He's asking if you could talk a little bit more about where a department can go for policy and training guidance, and also where to find certified instruction.
Okay, there are several really good websites to go to, and what I would do is, I don't know if I lost the one website is www.cbp, and it has a lot of good documents on use of force policy. It has a handbook, very good reading. Also, go to JetsNet. WPSTC has put out a guide on less lethal technologies. Once again, it is a very good informational guide. NIJ does produce several less lethal documents, and if you go to the NIJ website and go to less lethal, you could read up on those. Also, there are several less lethal articles at NIJ, very good reading. And the final one, and I mentioned this before, is the President's Task Force Final Report, and you can locate that at www.copsUSDOJ.gov. If you go to my link on the reference page and read about that. There's a whole lot of information out there. If you start searching for it, you'll see a lot of departments have put their stuff on the web. I would do your due diligence and really go through it. Some departments have very good policies and procedures, while others may need a little bit of work on them. But once again, it is imperative that everyone review this at least annually, because the biggest thing we're seeing right now is the public's perception. Things are changing. Everybody in law enforcement knows they have to gain situational control, but we have to do this in such a way that it's agreeable with the community that you're applying it to. So you really have to be in touch with the community, and doing this through community-based policing. I know one of our questions, and I'll bring this one up, is that we had earlier before the webinar started. If I'm a police chief of 22-man police force on a campus, what less than lethal devices would you suggest? And I actually asked some officers that work on campuses, and I had a couple of varying things, but I think my solution for them, of course, would be a baton first and pepper spray. And anything else, the academics, the parents, the community, might not work very well. But I do caution using pepper spray in a campus environment. Your officers need to be really well trained using pepper spray in confined spaces. You may have problems with others in close proximity if you pepper spray someone in a classroom, someone in a hallway. So it's really paramount that you include a lot of training in your less lethal technologies that you deploy. I was really surprised. The one individual, and he's an officer on a campus, he told me batons weren't issued to him, and then a couple years later they did. And I asked him, well, why? What was? And a baton is a very intimidating, less than lethal, and usually you gain situational control by just taking it out before you even have to use it. So you may want to give it some really serious thought. What's less lethal that your officers carry? Would there be another question?
Another question in the chat box. It's asking our model police agencies or policies that are considered leaders in having high standards for less lethal technologies. Do you have any recommendations with regards to model police agencies that are using these technologies?
I do not have a specific agency. If we get the individual departmental name, what we can do is maybe point them in the right direction. Right now, I don't have one that I could give you offhand to really point them to. I mean, there are, depending on size of the department and everything, if it's a large department, NYPD has a very good model. Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, LAPD, any of the larger metropolitan areas, I would look look to see what their model is. And then, of course, if it's a medium or small agency, we may be able to put them in touch with some agencies that have good models.
Great, thanks, Charles. We also got one other question prior to the webinar where one of our registrants was asking about the use of body-worn cameras and how that relates to being a less lethal weapon. Do you have any insights to share with the group on this?
I do, and I was really surprised when the President's report actually specifically got into body-worn cameras. And at my earlier slide during the presentation, just the use of body-worn cameras is a less lethal, because we're seeing the use of force drop by departments that use body-worn cameras. And of course, the best thing is if you don't have to use such a less lethal weapon as blunt force or something that actually affects it. So in a sense, a body-worn camera, by the mere presence of an officer wearing a camera, is causing us to not have to use force or a form of less lethal force. So it gains control. The officer gains control of the situation. You gain compliance. And a plus side of the use of body-worn cameras is we're seeing complaints drop, which is great for the department.
Great, thanks, Charles. We got one other question for you, asking if you had any thoughts on carotid neck hold or choke holds.
That's a little bit of a slippery slope. Of course, any type of neck hold, most departments don't use them, and definitely not choke holds. So it's for departments considering something like that. I would really check your legal department and everything, and try to stay away from any type of hold that you're going to that has the potential to really seriously injure someone, especially chokeholds.
Thank you, Charles. We have a follow-up question with regards to body-worn cameras from one of our audience members. They're asking if you think body-worn cameras should be used whenever less than lethal force is employed, and would this help the use and possible liability in lawsuits?
Yeah, most definitely. Anytime an officer does anything, I think a body-worn camera should be on. It clears the officer of any doubt. It's not a he said, she said situation. They have the body-worn camera. Most definitely, I think body-worn cameras should be used when less is applied. A lot of times, they're going to come back and say, well, why did you use less lethal? Well, you could see why I used less lethal, or why did you use deadly force, even if that's the case. So in most departments, anytime they have a situation where they're actually speaking to someone, they have a suspect. I think they should turn their body-worn camera on.
Great, thanks, Charles. Any other final comments or questions from our audience today? You can put them in the chat box or you can speak and we'll capture those questions for you. Or as Charles mentioned, he put his information up on a slide. Feel free to reach out to him after the webinar or out to our Smart Policing Initiative team. It's at SPI@CNA.org, and we're happy to get some follow-up information for you. Okay, without any other final comments or questions, Charles, we want to really thank you today for presenting on this webinar for us. And we will follow up with everyone with the webinar recording and resources on the SPI website, and we highly encourage you to fill out the evaluation form after you close this webinar. Thank you very much.